Good afternoon. Welcome to today's Lagniappe lecture. In the back on the table, I have upcoming lectures, including next Wednesday. Mike Alexander will talk about Operation Cobra. For many of you regulars who come to lunchbox lectures, you know it's typically first and third Wednesday, but Rick Jacobs has been a good friend of the museum with great content for years, and this is the 75th anniversary of the invasion of Sicily. Also with us today in this great packed room on an off Wednesday for us are members of our Student Leadership Academy who are learning lessons of leadership in World War II. So how perfect today that up on the screen we have Patton and Montgomery. So we welcome you all to this lecture, and particularly Captain Jacobs. Take it away.
If you would, you could either turn off your cell phone, which would be a great idea, or if you're worried that the president may be trying to reach you at any moment, just put it on vibrate, please.
Only on Twitter.
Okay, General Eisenhower commanded Operation Husky, which was the code name for the invasion of Sicily. And he did it with the same subordinates he had in the campaign in North Africa, who were virtually all British. As you can see from the flags that I conveniently put on this photo, that's his commanders. There's Eisenhower, Tedder, the air commander. Next to him is Alexander, the ground commander. And next to him is Cunningham, who's the naval commander, all British. As a matter of fact, even the sentry standing here is British. So he's surrounded. Now Eisenhower, this is still early in his career, if you will, at the height of the military hierarchy. And he's not the general, the commander that he's yet to become. His role during the Sicilian campaign is much more a chairman of the board than someone actually directing operations. And so it devolved on his subcommanders, ground, air, and naval, to really work things out between themselves. It's like a committee system, which is not a good idea in military matters. The great principle for fighting wars is unity of command. And that was a bit lacking in the Sicilian campaign. To further exacerbate matters, the fighting in North Africa was ongoing as they were planning the invasion of Sicily, and all these people were involved in that, and so that's where their primary focus was at the time. The Alexander had 15th Army Group, that was the designation, and under him was Bernard Montgomery, who had the British 8th Army, and George Patton, who commanded the U.S. 7th Army. Now, the obvious objective for the campaign was Messina, here. Bear with me just a second. I want to turn this on. Pointer options, arrow options, visible, good. So, here's Messina, and that's the key spot. That's where you have to get to cut off the Germans, both coming in and going out. So, the original plan was devised, as you see here, with 7th Army landing in the, northwest, and British 8th Army landing in the southeast. Separated, but it gave them both a good shot at Messina. That was pretty much accepted in principle by both Eisenhower and Alexander. But then Montgomery got a hold of it, and he was, as he says, horrified by it. Let's see, he called it a dog's breakfast. This turned out to be a very popular expression with Montgomery. Lots of things were dog's breakfasts, and I'm not exactly sure what that means, except it's not good. Montgomery went on, it breaks every rule of practical fighting and would have no chance of success. There will be a first-class disaster. The proper answer is to bring the U.S. divisions in to land on the south coast. So what Montgomery wanted was Patton to land here and guard the flank of the British 8th Army as they advanced up the coast and won the battle, if you will. Now, Admiral Cunningham, the head of the naval forces, was very pleased. He liked this plan because it took maximum advantage of naval mobility. And Montgomery, one of the most abrasive men in the history of the world, and Cunningham, who was a very strong-minded individual himself, nearly came to blows over this. As a matter of fact, at one point it reached the point where Cunningham refused to have Montgomery's name mentioned in his presence. Well, Alexander was unable to control Montgomery, as most people were, and so he revealed what he thought of Eisenhower when he said, well, if I can't resolve this, let's refer it to Churchill. Not to Eisenhower, to Churchill. Cunningham wouldn't hear of that and insisted that it goes to Eisenhower, but Eisenhower, again, he's not the strong leader he will become, and also he's in command of a coalition. Now, the thing about coalitions is they're always negotiations. You don't order, you're an American general, you don't order Montgomery, a British general, to do things as you would order an American general. There's negotiations, there's politics, there's all kinds of nuances. And if you create a political crisis, if you come down hard on Montgomery and he comes back hard at you, then where are we? It's a disaster is what it is. So there's this gloom in the air, there's confusion about what the plan should be, and Eisenhower kind of takes this on himself, and so he writes a gloomy message to Churchill saying that if there are 2 or more German divisions present in Sicily, they can't do it. The campaign won't work. Well, Churchill, who is not a gentle man, despite his sort of roly-poly look, he was ferocious at times, often, as a matter of fact, and he was also a very determined man. The Latin expression, the Romans would have called it, he's got auctoritas, he's got authority, and he knows how to use it, and he does use it. So I'm going to read you this. This is the message he sends in reply to Eisenhower, saying 2 German divisions, and that'll blow up the campaign. This is Churchill. This statement contrasts oddly with the confidence which General Eisenhower showed recently about invading the continent across the Channel, where he would have to meet a great many more than 2 German divisions. The Americans had been pressing to invade France in 1943 at the latest, and really Marshall wanted to go in 1942 if he could. Churchill goes on. If 2 German divisions is held to be decisive against any operations open to the 1 million men now in French North Africa, it is difficult to see how the war can be carried on. Months of preparation, sea power and air power in abundance, and yet 2 German divisions are sufficient to knock it all on the head. The operation must either be entrusted to someone who believes in it or abandoned. These are pusillanimous and defeatist doctrines. I regard the matter as serious in the last degree. We have told the Russians they cannot have their supplies by the northern convoy route for the sake of Husky. And now Husky is to be abandoned if there are 2 German divisions, strength unspecified, in the neighborhood. What Stalin would think of this when he has 185 German divisions on his front, I cannot imagine. Well, Churchill, having breathed fire over everyone, must have been very gratified when he got a message in reply from Eisenhower that said, oh no, I'm delighted to carry out my orders, we're going to invade Sicily, we're going to win, it's all okay, don't worry, Mr. Churchill. So, as so often happened in the war, Montgomery's rude, stubborn determination carried the day, and Ike approved of his plan with its ignominious role for Patton's army. Patton didn't like it, but he had to obey orders. A fact Eisenhower knew and even told him. He said, I know you'll do it, whereas goodness knows what will happen if I tell Montgomery that we won't. So he's afraid of that, again, of the political explosion. Coalition warfare. Patton accepted his fate, but seethed over it, and he considered it a betrayal of American forces by Eisenhower. Now, these are expressions from Patton's diary, and I think you always have to take diaries with a grain of salt, because that's what diaries are for. You're mad, your emotions are riling, and you just go write it down, whatever comes out of your pen. So whether that was his considered opinion, again, we have to take that with a grain of salt. So, who was there? There he is, the great man himself, Montgomery. Ooh, right. Okay, so this is what the tactical situation looked like. There are two full German divisions. 15th Panzer Grenadier in the west, the Hermann Goering Division in the center and south, and a composite, what they call the Kampfgruppe, a war group, in the east called Kampfgruppe Schmalz, which had elements of both the Hermann Goering and the 15th Panzer Grenadiers in it together. They were about a regiment or so. Both the 15th Panzer Grenadiers and the Hermann Goering were new formations. They had revived the numbering, but they were lost. The original units were lost at the surrender in Tunisia. So these are reasonably raw troops, not the ferocious German fighters that we were to see later. There are about 300,000 Axis troops in all, but you have to discount most of the Italians, who were coastal divisions, no mobility. I've shown with the Italian flag the 4 mobile Italian divisions, and they had some good formations contained in them. Let's see. There's there. Now, on July 9th, the Allied invasion fleet was closing on Sicily when the winds kicked up to over 40 miles an hour. Most of the troops were being carried on things like LSTs, which are flat-bottomed, and so when you get into big seas, it's no fun. They tend to do that. And many of them were on smaller vessels, LCMs and so forth. And so everybody gets seasick. It's absolutely miserable. I've been in those waters, and I watched destroyers, which were 300 plus feet long, angle, sharp keel, and they would ride up one side of the wave and down the other. The Mediterranean is relatively shallow for sea, and so it kicks up fast. That's what was happening. Everybody was miserable. The troops on the bigger vessels like the LSTs were in cargo holds with bunks 10 stacked high. Everybody's sick, throwing up. It's no fun. Now, on D-Day, to complete our order of battle, the British committed 4 infantry divisions and 1 airborne brigade. The U.S. Army had 3 infantry divisions, a reinforced regiment of the 82nd Airborne, and 2 battalions of the legendary Darby's Rangers. 7 divisions in all landed on D-Day. That's 2 more than landed at Normandy. There were 3,200 vessels involved. This is a big, big operation. Now, the siege subsided before the vessels came, before the landings on the 10th. But the weather was just disastrous for the airborne effort, which preceded it the day before, or the night before, I should say. The British glider-borne 1st Air Landing Brigade, 2,200 strong, was supposed to seize Point Grandi, which is down here, and there's a bridge that connects to the 2 main ports of Syracuse and Augusta, and that was their mission. Often you use airborne like this. They're very mobile, but they're light. They don't carry much in the way of weaponry, except what the men can carry. And so they're at the mercy of heavier troops. So what happens is the gliders are coming in, they're being towed by tow planes, and the winds are blowing, the Italians are setting off flares, there's smoke, there's gunfire, and some of the tow plane pilots either lose their nerve, don't know where they are. It's just a mess. And many of them release the gliders too soon before they even cross the coast. Half the gliders went down at sea, 252 men drowned. This is the British gliders. Only 12 came down on their target, the bridge they were supposed to seize. They fought hard, they ran out of ammunition, and with just 15 men still left to fight, they surrendered. But the bridge was soon retaken by the advancing British infantry, and so the mission was really a success. Hard won, but success. The British have the road. So the British take the two ports, Augusta and Syracuse, and Montgomery, there's a vacuum in front of him, and he senses this, and he says, now's the time to go. We got to go hard and go fast. So he devised a bold, complex plan, an airborne assault to seize the bridge at Primasoli, which is right here. Okay? The idea is they'll seize the bridge. There'll be a column of infantry with some armor, advance quickly up to take the bridge. They'll go on to Catania, the port up there. They'll have flanked the Germans. Remember, think back to that map, Hermann Goering, 15th Panzer. They'll be around their right flank, charge up the coastal road to Messina. Campaign's over, glory and victory. It all sounds great. But it's a complicated plan. He's going to put a commando brigade, Royal Marine Commando Brigade is going to seize an intermediary bridge right here about Lentini, while the paratroopers parachute into the plane, that's the Catania plane, and go on to seize the bridge there. Boom, the relieving force comes up, and it's all victory. For those of you who know the campaign, this is very, very similar to Arnhem, A Bridge Too Far, just on a smaller scale. Okay? Dreams of glory, dreams of glory. Okay, I think we can go on. No, oh, I got myself, sorry. Just as at Market Garden, British intelligence said, oh, the Germans are in disarray, there won't be much resistance there, it'll all be okay. So the 1st Parachute Brigade, British Parachute Brigade, known as the Red Devils, jumped in on the night of July 13th and 14th, but they were a day late. The day before, 4 battalions of elite German Fallschirmjägers, paratroopers, jumped into the Catania plain and formed up around the bridge and gave them that extra force there. Schmaltz, Kampfgruppe Schmaltz, fell back to around Lentini. So you have, as opposed to little resistance, you have some of the finest German troops there are, these Fallschirmjägers, around the bridge, and you have Schmaltz falling back to Lentini in the way of the commando brigade that's supposed to take the intermediary bridge. Now, the jump into the Catania Plains, the Red Devils, the British airborne jump, was another fiasco. There's friendly fire, they pass over Allied ships who shoot at them because throughout the campaign there's very little air power, and you can tell sailors don't shoot, but it doesn't work. The guys up there, they don't mean us any good, and that's what they do, they shoot. That's why you have to go around them, you can't go over them. At any rate, of 145 aircraft bringing the British paratroopers, 26 turned back, 14 were shot down, and out of 1,800 men, less than 300 landed near the bridge, their objective. So, the Marine Commando seized the bridge at Lentini, but was stopped by Kampfgruppe Schmaltz, and the Marines were nearly helpless because Schmaltz has heavy weapons, he's got some artillery, Marine Commando, just like the airborne. All they carry some guns, maybe a few light machine guns. So the Germans drive them from the bridge. They suffer 60% casualties, but luckily the cavalry arrives in time and they seize the bridge before the Germans can wire it for demolition. So the British are through that bottleneck, if you will. But they're 12 hours behind schedule. The British paratroopers, their casualties are going up and up and up. Notice all this is within range of naval gunfire, but they never quite worked that out. They never said, oh, we could get some ships up here and shoot at them. That never happened. They tried to. They had poor communications. Essentially, it didn't happen. Keep that in mind because I'm going to talk in a few moments about U.S. Navy's contribution to keeping the U.S. Army ashore during a counterattack. At any rate, the Germans forced the paratroopers from the bridge, and they've just seized the bridge again when a squadron from the 4th Armored Brigade, British 4th Armored Brigade, arrives. And the paratroopers say, attack, come on, let's go. They've just gotten here, they've got to be disorganized, let's go. And the commander of the tank squadron says, no, I can't attack without infantry. Okay, so 2 hours later, a battalion of the Durham Light Infantry arrives, but they've been marching 20 miles in the July heat, and they're in no shape to attack. So that night, the German paratroopers are reinforced, and by the time the British mount an attack the next day, they don't have a chance. It's only one battalion. They get cut to ribbons. Over the next few days, piecemeal, the British commit their reinforcements piecemeal. It never works out, and the front goes static. It's weeks before Catania falls. Ironically, with having drawn the Germans south, there was nobody in Catania. They could have taken that Marine Commando and a decent naval force and seized the port of Catania and cut off all those Germans to the south, but that never happened. That's one of those might have beens. So let's look to the American effort now. That's James Gavin, quite a guy. That's him in something of a formal portrait, and you can see him over there getting ready to jump. He was known as Jumpin' Jim Gavin because he made a lot of combat jumps. I would like to draw your attention to the load that these men are carrying. Look at this guy. That he's got about like 3 or 4 steps to get up to go into the C-47. These are strong, vigorous young men, and often someone would have to be pushing them and pulling them. They're carrying so much stuff. As a matter of fact, during Desert Storm, the Marines refer to the paratroopers as a soldier looking for a handout because you can only carry so much stuff and it only lasts so long. At any rate, Gavin, quite a guy. He was he was an orphan from the Pennsylvania coal fields. He only got an 8th grade education, but then he enlisted in the Army in the 30s during the Depression and won a competitive scholarship to West Point. Graduates from West Point and decides to go into the airborne, which is where ambitious young officers go because it's a brand new service or arm of the service and lots of opportunity. And boy, oh boy, Gavin was a man who could take advantage of opportunity, rightly so. He quickly rises to command, and he's got the 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment. He's in command of that for Operation Husky. He's the first man of 3,000 out the plane when they jumped at Sicily. Brave guy. So that's just before midnight, and just as with the British, although our guys pretty much land over Sicily, they don't drop them in the water, but they're scattered all over the place. Gavin writes that when he finally got on the ground, he was glad to hear the sound of artillery because he knew at least he was in Sicily. And that's all he knew. So, warrior that he is, he gathers whoever's around him, 8 men, that's what they wind up with, and march to the sound of the guns. And across southern Sicily, that's what the paratroopers are doing. These are terrific soldiers, aggressive, and they form up whatever they can and march off to war. They were scattered all over the place. At one point, Gavin and his 8 get in a firefight with an Italian patrol, and they're forced to retreat. Gavin is the last man going back. He's covering for his men. That's typical. Let's see, I think Lieutenant Peter Eaton, he gathered together about 50 paratroopers, and they ambushed a battalion of the Hermann Goering and dispersed them. And again, keep in mind, the Hermann Goering is going to be a crack outfit, but it's not yet. They're green troops. They're as nervous as anybody else, and oh boy, fire, and they go away. That's what confident men can do in battle. Okay, so what develops, the 8th Army pretty much had it easy after the landings. Very little resistance in there. They're rushing off into the interior. That's not true for Patton's 7th Army. They soon had significant counterattacks, and there were desperate moments on D-Day and D+1. As a matter of fact, the 1st Infantry Division, Big Red 1, held firm, and it's generally thought that had they not done so, it could have been a disaster. But they did. However, during the combat, it looks grim, and 7th Army decides to call in a reserve of paratroopers. There's another parachute regiment in reserve, and so they say, we need those guys right now. Send them over. It's another disaster. The C-47s go over the U.S. fleet. Again, sailors nervous. They've been under attack for 2 days. People rush out and say, hey, don't shoot, there's some paratroopers coming. What did that guy say? I don't know. Up, planes. And the Germans have been attacking, and ba-boom, there's another friendly fire incident that goes on. And it's pretty bad. Of 144 aircraft, 23 were lost, 37 severely damaged, and there are 289 casualties. And all of this occurs really after the crisis of the battle had passed, which we know now, but those who were in the battle hadn't foreseen. You know, it's not like you say, oh, send the paratroopers and boom, they drop. It takes time. At any rate, that's a disaster. But 7th Army holds the beaches and start to advance, as they should. Middleton, General Troy Middleton, who was at LSU prior to World War II, his 45th Division, which was a rookie division, you can see it over here, advances towards the town of Vizzini, a key road junction, not railroad. And late on the afternoon of D+3, they're only 3 miles from Highway 124. This is a critical highway running like so, across from east to west. So they're just 3 miles away. The Germans are in a desperate position. The Hermann Goering is stretched out over 20 miles, facing 4 Allied divisions. There's a gap of 20 miles on their left to Kampfgruppe Schmalz, who seems to have their hands full fighting the Brits on the plain of Catania. The 45th Division is set to split the German front wide open. It's a crucial moment. However, the day before, the Brits jumped at Primasoli. Montgomery was feeling expansive. The spearhead of the 51st Division, the Highland Division, was on Highway 124, and they were just 3 miles from Vizzini, and meeting little resistance. So, thinking the town is going to fall quickly, he ordered the Scots to take it, then turn north in support of 13th Corps. In other words, they're going to take Vizzini and go this way on the road towards Primasoli, and the Canadians, the 1st Canadian Division, is going to go through Vizzini, and they're going to head west along Highway 124. Now there's only one problem with this, is that there was supposed to be a boundary, at least a nominal boundary, at least as far as Vizzini, between the 8th Army and the 7th Army. And what Montgomery was proposing, look, he's going to have one division march right across the front of the U.S. Army. 3 U.S. divisions, third is over here. It's going to block them completely. So he says, he goes, Montgomery goes to Alexander and he says, look, I want the boundary shifted. And Alexander says, well, you know, I never really said that that was a hard boundary. I mean, we had this boundary up to Vizzini, but, you know, and Alexander's an amiable man, and Montgomery's a real pain in the butt, and nobody ever controls him anyway. And so he agrees, yeah, why not? Alexander had no firm plan for the campaign at all. He had a plan to get him ashore, and then he'll wait and see events. So the Brits get the road, the boundary is shifted. Now, Montgomery, when he requested this boundary shift from Alexander, said he was already in Vizzini. The Scots had already taken Vizzini. This was not true. And I love what the British official history says about this. It graciously states that Montgomery was not concerned with details. He took a most hopeful view of prospects. Oh, isn't that nice? What he wanted was the U.S. Army to give him the road and get out of the way. A bit about Alexander. There's Alexander. And I think the first thing you notice about Alexander is he's beautifully tailored. I mean, look at this uniform. Now that's Henry Stimson, just to his left, in the middle of the two generals. Stimson was Secretary of War. He's dressed like, what, a small-town banker, maybe? And on the far left is Jumbo Wilson, who was the theater commander further east. And he looks like he's carrying his lunch in his pockets. Alexander, of course, has nothing in his pockets, because that's what one's man carries, one's accoutrements, and it doesn't interfere with the drape of your uniform. He's quite a guy. This is his ancestral home in Northern Ireland. Nice little spot. I'm sure all of us have comparable houses here and there. So he's a real aristocrat. And this is him just before World War I. Again, what a uniform, huh? Gee whiz. Always well-tailored. So, and by the way, Alexander was one of the bravest men in the world. He had a combat record second to none. He just wasn't, well, this was not his milieu. He was in over his head as an army group commander, to be quite frank. His headquarters were in a Tunisian villa, fairly removed from the scene of the action. And it was run like a good English country house. No one would discuss business over the mess, at mess, you know, over the meals. That's gauche. Unless maybe there's an American visitor and he might bring it up, but, well, we just don't worry about that. So he's vague about what's going on, and he gives Montgomery permission. Patton, he visited Patton on that day, just before the word came out that Montgomery was going to get the road, and he never said a word to Patton. Now that's not the way to deal with a commanding general of an army. At any rate, that's what happened. Gosh, he sure dressed well. So, unfortunately, as at Primasoli, 8th Army didn't move far enough, fast enough. Now you have to appreciate the load. These are infantrymen. The British had decided to front load their invasion with troops and the necessary to fight. They weren't bringing trucks, they were bringing men. So, a World War II infantryman carried about 70 pounds of various things on his back. To get to Vizzini, the Scots had climbed 2,000 feet and marched 100 miles in 3 days in the July heat in Sicily. So this is a pretty tough climb. And just like the Durham Light Infantry at Premazzoli, they're exhausted. Not only are they exhausted, but the morale was fairly down. This is what Carlo d'Este has to say about the British at this juncture. The infantry were tired, bloody tired, of marching and of war. They had seen enough in North Africa to last them for a long time. Trudging in the summer heat along the dusty, rutted roads of Sicily was not their idea of how the victorious desert army should be treated. Possibly fresher troops, as some of the Americans proved, would have moved faster and with a little more enthusiasm. But Montgomery had insisted on using his battle-proven veterans, and they were fatigued and browned off. Browned off, that's an interesting expression. You know what it means. They're just in a funk. So, it takes the British, hold on. It takes the Scots 2 days to get through to the west of Vizzini. The Hermann Goering escaped and fell back, tied in with Schmaltz. And they also gave time for the 15th Panzer Grenadiers to come out of the western part of Sicily and form up what was known as the Etna line, from Catania to the Tyrrhenian Sea, with Schmaltz, the Hermann Goering, and the 15th Panzer Grenadiers. They've also got 2 regiments of the Fallschirmjäger, as good a troops as you can find, and they bring another Panzer Grenadier regiment over from Italy. So that becomes a very hard place, the Etna line. The decisive moment of the campaign had been bungled. Had 45th Infantry Division been allowed to go in behind Vizzini, it would have been all over. Or as near as we can tell, I mean, in war, it's always possible to lose. But it was, Carlo d'Este, by the way, who's a fine historian, maybe the best military historian writing now. This is his judgment, pretty much, that that was it. The decisive moment was there, and it was bungled. Alexander and Montgomery, apart from poor operational judgment and bad manners, exposed the inherent problem of Monte's approach to the invasion of Sicily. There just wasn't enough room for 7 divisions to operate through here. That's what Patton realized, and that's what they should have done. They never should have landed 7th Army in the nowhere of the the Gila Gulf. It's in military terms, you say the front is too narrow. I've got all these forces, it's too narrow, and so you can't employ them properly. So instead of breaking the enemy front, there's Patton. Instead of breaking the enemy front, 45th Infantry Division disengaged, marched back to the beach, back to the rear, and all of 7th Army was blocked going forward. Let me give you, let's see. Well, you can see how that would work. Now the question is, Patton, the fiery tempered Patton, why didn't he object? How was it that he just accepted this? Not what you think of with George Patton, and rightly so, as a matter of fact. General Omar Bradley, who was the 2nd Corps commander, was furious about this and begged Patton to at least let him use the highway to move west. Okay, just let me operate on 124, and I'll get over here, and at least we can do something. And the blood that we lost getting to Vizzini won't be completely wasted. Patton tells him, obey orders. Now, why was that? Again, well, the reason was Dwight Eisenhower. Despite that sunny smile that he had, Eisenhower had a ferocious temper, and he liked to indulge it from time to time on George Patton. he had told Patton, before the invasion of Sicily, he said to Patton, you know, George, I might want to just leave you in command for 7 or 8 days, and then we'll put Bradley in charge. And Patton said, well, you know, I kind of like to finish what I started. So Patton's getting a little leery here. Then, after that incident where the U.S. paratroopers on day 2 were shot to bits, Eisenhower sends Patton a furious cable blaming him for everything. Well, that's Monday morning quarterbacking. I mean, at the time it seemed like what you were supposed to do. It turned out to be not unnecessary, but imagine how foolish it would have felt if they'd been driven into the sea instead. So he blisters him. Then the next day, after the abortive parachute jump, Eisenhower visits Patton's headquarters. He doesn't compliment anybody about anything. He doesn't say, hey, good work, you're sure, you're moving forward, none of that. And instead, he complains to him that Patton is not keeping Ike informed about what's going on. I'm not getting the message traffic from you that I should. Well, again, that's grossly unfair because Patton didn't work for Eisenhower. He worked for Alexander. So if Ike's not getting the message traffic he thinks he deserves, he needs to talk to Alexander, not to Patton. But so Patton is not feeling exactly confident. He feels like, hey, the knives are out for me. They're going to get rid. If I give them any excuse at all, they're going to get rid of me. And certainly, if he's thinking, and gosh, if I just tell Alexander and Montgomery to go fly a kite, I'm going to break the front of Vizzini. That's it for George. He'll be back at home training recruits in another week and a half. Well, if I may, I'm going to take a little diversion here to talk about someone else who interfaced with Patton, namely Bill Mauldin. Mauldin was Bill Mauldin, the famous cartoonist Willie and Joe. That's who you see here. Can you read the captions at the back? This one says, I can't get no lower, Willie. Me buttons is in the way. And on the right it says, no thanks, Willie. I'll go look for some mud what ain't been used. He's bathing. Mauldin was beloved throughout. After 45th Division, he went to Stars and Stripes. He was just beloved. As a matter of fact, when he passed away, Charles Schulz had a cartoon of Snoopy dressed like a GI marching through some desolate village and saying, it was you, Bill, you're the one that led the way. Because Schulz was in the war, and the troops absolutely loved Bill Mauldin. Patton hated him because George Patton, right? Look, this man is beautifully uniformed also, well tailored. And these guys, they're not. Let's just put it that way. Now Mauldin, a child of the Depression. He was 5 feet 10 inches tall and weighed 110 pounds when he joined the Army. He actually joined the National Guard in the late 30s, very late 30s, early 40s, because he wanted, he thought America should fight in the European War, and also there was $21 a month that you got paid for being in the National Guard, not to be scoffed at in those days. And the other guys, the 45th Division was made up of similar children of the Dust Bowl, or men of the Dust Bowl, I shouldn't call them children, that were, they come from very, very hard times. So, Patton hates the cartoons, the troops love him. Mauldin's a cartoonist, but he goes to the front constantly. And that's why there's such a look of authenticity about his paintings. So, Eisenhower's naval aide got an idea that maybe if we got Mauldin and Patton together, they could, talk and be nice to each other, and it'd ease the tensions. Mauldin thought he was being sent on a suicide mission to meet Patton. And this is his description of Patton. His hair was silver, his face pink, his collar and shoulders glittered with more stars than I could count. His fingers sparkled with rings, and an incredible mass of ribbons started around desktop level and spread upward in a flood over his chest to the very top of his shoulder, as if preparing to march down his back too. His face was rugged, his eyes were pale, almost colorless, with a choleric bulge. His lower lip suggested a pouting child as much as a no-nonsense martinet. In a big chair was Willie, the bull terrier. If ever dog was suited to its master, this one was. I stood in the door staring at the 4 meanest eyes I ever saw. This is a great cartoon. The caption for this, which I couldn't get on it, is Willie saying to Joe, "Call the old man and tell him we'll be three days late getting back, because they're supposed to go into Third Army, and if you could read it, it's no helmet, no shave. There's all these fines lined up, and look at Willie and Joe. So they're going to go around Third Army to get back to their unit. At any rate, naturally, Patton dominated this meeting between him and Mauldin. I mean, it's 3 stars versus 3 stripes. And at times he delivered a tirade, and other times he gave what Mauldin called a masterful discourse about armies and leaders of the past, of rank and its importance. Patton was a master of this subject. I felt truly privileged, as if I were hearing Michelangelo on painting. I felt whatever martial spirit was left in me being lifted out and fanned into flames. Mauldin respected Patton. He wrote, "I always admired Patton. Oh, sure, the stupid bastard was crazy. He thought he was living in the Dark Ages, but I certainly respected his theories and the techniques he used to get his men out of their foxholes." That's Mauldin and Patton. So, now Patton, having just had the door slammed in his face by Alexander and Montgomery, was not going to just sit down on the beach here waiting submissively to see what would happen. He said, what I need is a port. So he goes to Lucian Truscott, commander of the 3rd Division, 3rd U.S. Division, and he says, "Lucian, Alexander won't let me do it, but could you sort of move around Agrigento and Empedocles and see what develops there?" And Truscott says, "Yeah, I think we can have a reconnaissance in force." And so 2 days later, Patton has the port and all the logistics that brings, because they had been bringing in their stuff over the beach, and now they had a port, which means you've got more reach. And so he heads for Palermo. Now, he is generally criticized heavily for doing this. Even to Este, who a moment ago I said, and I still do, I think he's a terrific historian. He criticizes him, and Bradley, of course, just hammers him over this. It's useless, it's nonsense, it's this, it's that, it's the other thing. That's all nonsense. What Patton realized is Messina. That's the name of the game in Sicily. And the only way for the U.S. Army to get to Messina is to go go west and then north of Etna. Only way there. And so, why not take Palermo, which is where he should have landed in the first place? You get the best port in Sicily, all the naval support and logistics that can come through that, and that's what he did, by golly. He went off and took Palermo. Now, it's real clever, to get permission, because he had to ask Alexander if he could do this, unannounced, he shows up at Alexander's headquarters in Tunisia, and he's got with him Brigadier General Albert Wiedemeyer. Wiedemeyer was the #1 planner in Washington on George Marshall's staff. So, what that means is, when Patton says, "Hey, I'd like to go to Palermo," Alexander's reaction is going to get back to Marshall, a very crusty human being, and you don't want him on your bad side. And besides which, Alexander's an agreeable man. So he agrees. "Yeah, okay, George, you want to go to Palermo? By golly, go ahead and do it." And boom, Patton takes off. as I say, that was absolutely the thing to do. That's where he should have landed in the first place, and that's where he wound up. Now, let me just orient you on the map. When they get north, Patton grabs Palermo, his 45th Division, and it's going to advance along the Tyrrhenian coast. And here's the 1st Infantry, Big Red 1, and it's going to advance along this highway, Highway 120, towards Troina. Now, this is terrible hard ground to fight over. It's mountainous, it's rocky. The Germans are terrific at this. They've got positional warfare. They're geniuses, I should say, at positional warfare. And what they would do is they'd get a detachment of men, a couple of pieces of artillery, get on a hilltop overlooking the road, shoot up the GIs as they advance. As the weight of the Allied forces started to make itself felt, they'd pull back. And then you have to do it all over again. It was very, very hard fighting. And by this time, the Panzer Grenadiers are veteran troops. They've been molded by their NCOs and their officers and the ferocious discipline of the German army, and they're fighting hard. Between them, the 1st Division, of course, is our most veteran troops, and this produces some of the hardest fighting of the war between these troops. By the way, the virtue of Palermo proves itself here as Morrison writes in his History of U.S. Naval Operations. One day after Palermo fell, the U.S. Navy was operating out of it. Hundreds of tons of artillery, ammunition, and rations were moved through it along the coast, bypassing roadblocks, landmines, and blown bridges that held up Army trucks. Just what you want. Naval. Always remember that. Sea power. It's always a good thing. Now, meanwhile, Montgomery is going nowhere. He's got one corps over here, he's got another corps over there, fighting kind of separate battles. And so he gets an idea. He says, maybe the Americans can actually do some good here. So he calls Patton and says, come on down to Syracuse. I want to talk to you about the campaign. Well, Patton goes, but he's expecting an ambush. And it turns out Montgomery says, no, George, you can take Messina. You should take Messina. And if the Army boundaries get in the way, don't worry about it. Go right through. I'll be happy for that. Patton says, okay, we'll do. Alexander shows up after they've finished their meeting and says, what's going on, guys? And Montgomery, with that savoir-faire that was his uniquely, says, oh, it doesn't matter, we've already decided what's going to happen. To his boss, he tells him that. Well, Alexander was not a total piece of toast, and he insisted on being informed, and once he was, he said, oh, okay. Now, this brings us to Troina. Here. There's Bradley's staff told Terry Allen, who was the Major General commanding the 1st Infantry Division, that Troina was lightly held, the German morale was bad, you should be able to just walk right through. So Allen attacked with one regiment. It turns out that Troina was really the fulcrum of the Etna line and had a whole German division based around it. And look, this is what the world looked like from Troina. 600 feet high, you're looking down the barrel of your guns at the GIs trying to advance. There's no place for the GIs to hide. It's a terrible place to try to attack. So Allen attacks first with a regiment, then he attacks with 2 regiments, then he attacks with the whole division, and finally he gets 2 more regiments on loan from the 9th Infantry Division, and he attacks with everything he's got, huge weight of artillery, and they wind up taking Troina. But it's really a little bit too late. The Germans sense what was going on, and they back out. They get away, if you will. They make a stand for a while at this place, Cesaro, but their artillery and their vehicles keep on going to Messina, across the straits, and into Italy. And that's what that's the Germans' plan. They're gonna fight as hard as they can, bleed us as bad as they can, and then they're gonna go. They're gonna leave. Eventually they take Troina, and Bradley says that, well, Allen is no good. He kept attacking piecemeal. I'm going to relieve him. Get him out of there. Bradley conveniently ignores the fact that it was his intelligence that told Allen that it was lightly held. But Bradley hated Allen. Allen liked a cocktail from time to time. Bradley was extremely abstemious. And Bradley had been wanting to get rid of Allen since Tunisia. And now he's got it. He's going to relieve him. Patton says, no. Allen's exhausted, which is correct. I mean, he'd been fighting the division since North Africa. They'd been at war for over a year. And he says, yes, he needs to go home and get a rest, but the relief is going to be conducted without prejudice, meaning it's all okay. And that's what happens. And indeed, Allen is given another division and fights in Northwest Europe after D-Day with great distinction. There's Allen, and that very disheveled-looking gentleman on your right, that's Teddy Roosevelt Jr., who had a reputation of being the sloppiest general in the U.S. Army, but he had the heart of a lion. He was assistant division commander with the Big Red One. And after the relief, he was relieved also. He floated around for a little while, and then he became assistant division commander for the 4th Infantry Division. And he was the only general officer to go ashore on the first day of D-Day at Utah Beach. Patton said he was the bravest man he ever knew. And he was awarded the Medal of Honor for his conduct on D-Day. Unfortunately, he died of a heart attack a few weeks after D-Day, but boy, he was a terrific guy, great fighter. Now, I mentioned to you the, how the Germans seldom set up in a town. They would set up around the town, usually behind it, and fight from there. The Air Force was convinced that the way to stop them was to bomb the towns into oblivion, which they proceeded to do. And indeed, tactical air pretty much did that throughout the war. The devastation in Northwest Europe was appalling. This is Catania, which the Brits had fought for 3 weeks, and look at that, look at the rubble. What happened was that not only did it not bother the Germans very much, but the pursuing Allied forces had to get through that some kind of way. So it was worse for us than it was for the Germans, not to mention the suffering of the Sicilians. That photo was taken by this handsome but somewhat dissolute-looking gentleman, Robert Capa, the most famous photographer of World War II, combat photographer of World War II. Quite a guy. He was a Hungarian Jew, and when he wasn't photographing the war, by the way, he said, if your pictures aren't good enough, it's because you're not close enough. And he actually went ashore with the first wave at Omaha Beach. He left a little while afterwards, but you can't really blame him. At any rate, brave man. No criticisms of Robert Capa. That's his photo. This is his photo of Hemingway. Look how alive Hemingway looks. Because Capa, when he wasn't shooting the war, was rubbed elbows with stars and intellectual elites, such as Hemingway. And he was the lover of Ingrid Bergman. He took this picture. What a beauty she is, huh? Gee whiz, that's Capa. He was killed when he stepped on a landmine covering the war in Indochina in 1954. Great loss. Okay. Well, so this is tough ground to get over. And Patton and Bradley both had said, well, look, we have all this naval force. Let's use it. Let's have an amphibious landing. So they did. The Germans, when they fell back from Troina, the next stop was this place, San Fratello here's another ridge line, and now they're fighting the 3rd Infantry Division. So Patton orders a battalion landing behind them at St. Agata, which took place. Now, unfortunately, the landing force lost an LST to German air action the day before the landings were scheduled, and they had to delay the landings for another day. By that time, the Germans were already starting to move to the rear, retrograde movement as we call it. But the GIs, they couldn't stop them, a battalion against a division, but they inflicted some pretty heavy damage on them. 250 casualties, 100 POWs, and a bunch of tanks and vehicles were also destroyed. The Germans fell back to Brolo. Okay, this is Brolo, and you can see it on the map. Here's Messina, Brolo, and a place called Naso. Naso was their, they fell back to here. This is the ridge line that I think it's the 24th Panzer Grenadiers were there. At any rate, so Patton says, okay, we're going to do it again. We're going to have another battalion landing, same battalion, by the way, because they've been trained for this, behind the Germans. And again, they lost another LST to enemy air, and so that delayed the landings by a day. And then Bradley and Lucian Truscott, commander of the 3rd Infantry Division, came to Patton and said, look, we want another day. I'm trying to get my artillery forward, it'll support those men. Give us another day. And Patton says, no. Go ahead, obey your orders, make the landing. This is, for those of you that have seen the movie Patton, this is when they had that blow up, and Carl Mauldin is, berating George for just wanting a silly race to beat Montgomery to Messina and yada, yada, yada. All Hollywood bump, of course. And backed up by Bradley because, unfortunately, that movie was based largely on Bradley's book. So, obviously, Bradley's the hero. At any rate, the landing goes forward, and now this is even tighter. This is Lieutenant Colonel Bernard, who was in charge of that battalion landing team. And if ever a photographer captured a worried look on a man's face, that's him. There's a whole German division out there, and he's in a lot of trouble. The Navy showed up with the landings with a light cruiser, the Philadelphia, about half a dozen destroyers, and they were shooting up everything, and it broke up the initial German counterattacks. But they lost radio contact with Colonel Bernard's men. And so you can't just shoot blind. You don't know who's there. The Navy's sitting there, they're targets for the Luftwaffe, so they say, well, I guess we'll go back to Palermo. So they do. Bernard gets on the hook to Truscott and says, help me. They're overrunning us, we're all going to die. So Truscott himself goes to the Navy admiral and says, hey, help us, help us. And so the Navy goes back and shoots up some more, again loses radio contact. They do this about 2 or 3 times. And eventually, I mean, the battalion survives, but it's no fun. And they are relieved by Truscott without being decimated, but it's a very hard fight. Truscott fights his way through, and the battalion suffered significant but not catastrophic losses. And again, they inflict heavy losses on the Germans trying to get past it. Bradley attacked Patton posthumously, maligning him for ordering a reckless and pointless race with Montgomery to Messina. The official U.S. history disagrees. This is what it says. 3rd Division could have moved virtually unopposed and seized Messina, trapping a large part of the 29th Panzer Grenadiers. Few could have made it back to Italy. At least part of the Hermann Goering would also have been trapped. 5 days later, the Germans were gone. They evacuated 55,000 soldiers, including their wounded, 10,000 vehicles, tanks, guns, 19,000 tons of supplies. And those men fought the Allies up the boot of Italy, inflicting tens of thousands of casualties. Patton was trying to trap them, and prevent that. It was a great prize. Had he done so, it would have had strategic impact on the war. The war in Italy would have taken a different course. Patton was bold when the opportunity presented itself, and this was one of those times. And he's the only commander that had that sense of urgency. Bradley keeps saying, well, you know, we'll get to Messina next week or a few weeks after that. What the heck? Now, how did the Germans do this? It seemed like we had invincible air and naval power, and they're crossing the Straits of Messina. How could they possibly do that? Well, the Germans put up one of the heaviest anti-aircraft concentrations of the war to protect the strait. There's George. And the Air Force wasn't really particularly interested in the mission. They were going to win the war with strategic bombing. They wanted to go bomb Ploesti and Rome and every other place, and well, these guys are having a little fight down here, but we're going to win the war with strategic bombing. So they didn't much care. The bomber barons, as someone called them, they were going off to fight at Ploesti. You see, that was a coalition too, right? Not only do we have a coalition between the Americans and the British, we had a coalition between the Army, the Air Force, and the U.S. Navy. Now, Ike became a much greater commander as the war progressed, but he never solved the problem of Allied subordinates. And the reason for that is because there wasn't any solution. You can't do it. Marshal Foch, the great French commander in World War I, said he lost respect for Napoleon when he realized Napoleon always fought against coalitions. One man, unity of command, that's what you want, and you just don't get it in a coalition. I think there's a lesson to be learned in that for our current mania for coalitions, having allies, quote unquote, alliances everywhere, but the problem hasn't changed. There's still this idea of how do you tell coalition allies what to do, and the answer is you don't. Okay, I'm going to be speaking in November about Montgomery's greatest victory, the Battle of El Alamein, and I hope you can join me for that, and I'll be happy to take any questions. No questions? I must have completely explained that. Well, thank you very much for coming.
Good job. That's one of the best you did.